You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie from the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you are listening to your favorite international podcast. Thanks so much for your support, your downloads, and your reviews. And that's it for today, because I'd say without further ado, we will jump right in, because there's a lot to talk about today, right?
There is, yeah.
We are going to talk about the 27 Club and give you an overview about the lives and the deaths of the members of this club, which is made up of musicians, artists, actors, and other celebrities who died at the age of 27. And we'll discuss who they were, how they died, and what conspiracies or urban legends surround their untimely death. The 27 Club episodes will discuss addiction, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, alcohol, and because it's us, conspiracy, murder, and obviously, the devil.
Obviously, right? So, okay, the story of the 27 Club begins with Robert Johnson. I feel like I should warn people once again that they've started on the outside siding, and I'm afraid people are going to hear it. I know every week I say there's construction next door, and every week everyone says, I couldn't hear a thing, but then I feel like if I don't say it, it'll be like bang, 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 bang all throughout the background, and people will be like, what is going on at her house? So, the story of the 27 Club begins with Robert Johnson. He's the member that I actually knew the least about, and I think he has the most supernatural theories surrounding his talent. This is probably because there just isn't a lot of information out there on him. And so, I may end up saying this again, but the problem with Robert Johnson is if you find one thing that everyone says is a fact about this man, it's not long before you find something else that is also definitely a fact, but totally contradicts the first fact. It's just over and over with this one. So really, my apologies if I get anything wrong. Okay. Robert Johnson was probably born on a plantation in Hazelhurst, Mississippi in May of 1911 to Julia Major Dodd. I say probably because he was born before the state of Mississippi issued birth certificates. And of course, even if he'd been born a few years later, in many states it was a long time before black newborns were given birth certificates. Robert's grandparents were slaves, and Jim Crow laws that were created after slavery was outlawed were created to ensure strict segregation. This meant that in many cases, black women had to give birth at home or in special homes with midwives because they often weren't allowed in the whites-only hospitals. This isn't some long-ago problem either. There are people of color living today who have no birth certificate for this reason. So we don't know exactly when Robert was born, but we do know that he was apparently born out of wedlock. A lot of babies born outside of wedlock in these episodes about rock and roll stars. Shocking. So, Robert was the youngest with 10 older half-siblings. Their father, Julia's husband, was a carpenter who made furniture by the name of Charles Dodd. Charles had left the family. He didn't just leave, he didn't really abandon them. It's a really long, complicated story, but he was essentially run out of town by a lynch mob. And I mean a literal lynch mob. So he escaped the area and was able to settle in Memphis, where he changed his last name to Spencer. Now, her husband having left her, her marital status was now considered and listed as divorced. And Robert's mother then had a relationship with Robert's father, who was a field hand named Noah Johnson. Robert's early childhood was a difficult one. His mother was constantly trying to find work to support the children. She eventually moved back in with her ex-husband Charles, and I think probably his new wife as well. And Robert lived with them in Memphis from the age of 2. When he was 7 years old, his mom remarried, and he moved with them to Robinsonville, Mississippi. Young Robert loved music, and he played a diddley bow as a child. So here's what Wikipedia says about this instrument, quote, "The diddley bow is a single-stringed American instrument which influenced the development of the blues sound. It consists of a single string of baling wire tensioned between 2 nails on a board over a glass bottle, which is used both as a bridge and as a means to magnify the instrument's sound. It was traditionally considered a starter or children's instrument in the Deep South, especially in the African American community, and is rarely heard outside the rural South. It may have been influenced to some degree by West African instruments." End quote. So Robert was good enough on the diddly bow to get himself a real guitar, and was probably given lessons by his older brother Leroy. And he was living in Robinsonville, which was in the Mississippi Delta. And today I think it's just a bunch of casinos. But back then, Robert loved the juke joints as a teenager. Now, here again I have a Wikipedia quote for you because I read a couple of articles about juke joints. Surprise, surprise, we don't have them in New England. They're a very South sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Heritage. It's part of the South's heritage, juke joints.
I think, have you ever watched the movie about Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire?
Yes.
With Dennis Quaid, where when he's a kid, he's listening outside, he's looking into the juke joints where the black musicians are playing.
Yes.
Which heavily influenced.
I need to rewatch that.
Joint, kind of, no?
Is that the one with, is it Winona Ryder, his 13-year-old cousin that he marries? Yeah, I need to rewatch that. Yeah. So I found a really good Wikipedia quote because I kept reading articles about it, and then I was trying to figure out how to explain it, and then sometimes Wikipedia just
does the job.
It's faster than I can do it, honestly. We'd be here for days with me trying to explain these things. Okay, so, quote, juke joint, also juke joint, spelled J-O-O-K, or juke, is an informal establishment featuring music, dancing, gambling, and drinking, primarily operated by African Americans in the southeastern United States. A juke joint may also be called a barrel house. Classic juke joints found, for example, at rural crossroads, catered to the rural workforce that began to emerge after emancipation. Plantation workers and sharecroppers needed a place to relax and socialize following a hard week, particularly since they were barred from most white establishments by Jim Crow laws. Set up on the outskirts of town, often in ramshackle, abandoned buildings or private houses, never in newly constructed buildings, juke joints offered food, drink, dancing, and gambling for weary workers. Owners made extra money selling groceries or moonshine to patrons or providing cheap room and board. End quote. So Robert grew up in this very rich culture of the Mississippi Delta, the birthplace of the blues. Masterclass.com explains the blues as, quote, blues music is an American popular music form derived from the music of enslaved Africans, Black Americans, and sharecroppers in the mid-19th century, end quote. And speaking of sharecroppers, Robert wanted no part of that life. He hated farm labor with the fire of 10,000 suns, but he loved the blues. Robert saw Son House, a pioneer of the Delta blues, play regularly, and he had also started to create his own material and his own blues sound. Unfortunately, he knew a little something about the blues. In February of 1929, when he was around 18 or 19, he married Virginia Travis, his pregnant 16-year-old girlfriend. But she and the baby would both die in childbirth. Her family felt that this was punishment for his playing secular music, which... ouch. There's a story that will come into play later about Robert's playing, but according to Son House, Robert was often at their performances, and it seems one day the band took a break, and Robert decided to get up on stage himself and pick up one of the guitars and play. And it was bad. Like, it was really bad. Like, people came running outside to find Son House and let him know that he had to get back on stage and get this kid off the stage. So that was humiliating, right? But 6 months or so later, Robert returns, and this time he's absolutely amazing. Son House said that they were just completely jaws, hit the floor, completely amazed. And he knew then that Robert's career was going to be off like a shot. There's a great article from 2019 in the New York Times. It's part of a series that they did called Overlooked. And in this series, the Times covers people whose obituaries should have been published by the New York Times, but weren't, right? And Johnson's is one of them. And so Johnson's is written by Reggie Ugwu. It's a great piece, and he writes this about Robert's guitar playing, quote, "The guitar playing on Johnson's recordings was unusually complex for its time. Most early Delta blues musicians played simple guitar figures that harmonized with their voices. But Johnson, imitating the boogie-woogie style of piano playing, used his guitar to play rhythm, bass, and slide simultaneously, all while singing. Another innovation associated with Johnson, as noted by the critic Tony Sherman in 2009 in the New York Times, is the boogie bass. Appearing on Johnson's songs Ramblin' on My Mind and I Believe I'll Dust My Broom, the boogie bass, a low, ambling rhythm that evokes a swaggering strut, became a building block of both Chicago blues and rock and roll in the hands of the Johnson Apostles, Muddy Waters, and Elmore James." End quote. So Johnson was really a trailblazing musician, and he was good-looking, and he had absolutely no trouble meeting women. Again, I know, shocking, right? So we know he fathered a child with Virgie Mae Smith, a girlfriend of his at one time, but in the spring of 1931, he married again, and he married a woman named Coletta Craft, who was apparently 10 years older than Robert with 2 children, but they were happy. They were married, they moved to Clarksdale, Mississippi. You've been to Clarksdale, right? Did you?
I have. It's a lovely town with great music festival there. We did miss it, unfortunately, but really nice people, full of music history. There's so many musicians who started out in Clarksdale. It's so interesting.
It sounds amazing. Yeah. So, as I said before, one of the things that's really hard about Robert is the conflicting information, and either Coletta died in childbirth or Robert abandoned her in 1932. I'm pretty sure he left her, but either way, she is no longer in the picture. There's also a photograph out there claiming to be Robert and Coletta, but it's not Robert. I'm not sure if it's Coletta or not, but it's not Robert. There are only 2 photographs of him that exist. So, by 1932, he's back on the road, making a living as a musician. He's riding the rails and performing at juke joints. He used to play during the daytime to advertise to people that he'd be playing that night. People also said he was a really sharp dresser and managed to, spend all day sleeping in a railroad car and then, leap off a rolling rail car and managed to make himself look sharp as a tack, right? Even though he'd been all rumpled. He looked good in clothes. And he had women all over the country whose families welcomed him when he was in town or if their boyfriends were out of town. He also had his own very large extended family to stay with that could help him when he was traveling around the country because for somebody born in Mississippi at that time, he was playing gigs in Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and New York City. So Ogwu writes, again, this is that same article for the New York Times, quote, "What survives of Johnson's short career is based on his only 2 recording sessions, arranged by the American record company executive Don Law in 1936 and 1937 in Texas. One song from the first session, the vibrant Terraplane Blues, sold a respectable 5,000 copies, giving the singer the only real taste of fame he would know in his life. Another record executive, John Hammond of Columbia Records, championed Johnson's music decades after his death. Hammond, who launched the recording careers of Billie Holiday, Aretha Franklin, Bob Dylan, and Bruce Springsteen, issued a posthumous album in 1961 entitled King of the Delta Blues Singers, which compiled most of the American record company recordings. The album captivated a fledgling generation of musicians at the dawn of rock's golden age. As Eric Clapton wrote in 2007 in Clapton, the autobiography, describing his first encounter with the King of the Delta Blues, quote, "I realized that on some level I had found the master." End quote. You find so many of the rock and roll greats that we all know of today, right? Eric Clapton, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, Bob Dylan. They all credit Johnson as being a huge inspiration, and they refer to him as the grandfather of rock and roll. Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones said that when he was first introduced to Johnson's solo recordings by bandmate Brian Jones, he asked about the other guy playing with him. Quote, "I was hearing 2 guitars, and it took a long time to actually realize he was doing it all by himself," said Richards. Another thing that I learned researching this is how the Delta Blues became so popular with all of these English musicians. I was like, I just didn't know that much about him. I don't know. But he was so popular in England. And so looking into it, of course, it makes sense because during segregation, Black musicians preferred to tour outside of the United States in countries where they were treated as equals, right? So Robert never made it overseas, unfortunately. He died at the tragically young age of 27, making him the first member of the 27 Club. But how did he die? All right, so let's start with the legend, which goes something like this. Robert Johnson wanted more than anything in the world to be the best blues player that ever lived. So much so, in fact, that he went to the crossroads one night, and there he made a deal with the devil. He told Satan himself that he would give him his very soul in exchange for the talent he so desperately craved. That explained how there was such a short time between that first performance he gave, where he was booed off the stage at a performance that Son House was giving, and the next performance only 6 months later when he blew everyone away. Because as soon as he became the best blues player in the world, the devil collected on his bargain, taking his soul and ending his life. And he even wrote a song called Crossroads, and the crossroads where this bargain allegedly took place is a celebrated landmark in Clarksdale.
Yeah, the crossroads.
Yeah.
So apparently back then it was just two rural roads crossing in the middle of fields. Today it's a very busy intersection. I have a photo of the sign that marks the spot. I took the photo from the car while we were driving by because we didn't even stop there.
Is it just a tourist trap now?
I didn't exit. Actually, I think it's just a huge sign. I sent you the photo that just marks the spot. Yeah. So I didn't feel that anything in Clarksdale was really a tourist trap.
No.
In a way, I think just really blues, people who are interested in blues and musician and music history are going there. So
nice.
It's really nice and relaxed. That's how I experienced. We're very nice and relaxed.
That's great. I love that. It's a really good story. I wish it was a true story.
So good.
Right? But it's a legend. And it's a great legend that a lot of people believed. Ugo actually made a really good point again in his article. He wrote, quote, "As Johnson's music began to find an audience in the years after his death, however, critics, many of them white and mystified by black culture in the South, leaned into the legend," end quote. So there's a lot, you do see a lot of that sort of, when you read accounts of what he did, it's like suddenly voodoo is in there, but that doesn't make any sense. And just a bunch of white people were like, ooh, look what happened. In reality, the song Crossroads, or the Crossroad Blues, it's about having a hard time hitching a ride. And of course, at a deeper level, it speaks to the sundown laws, which were the segregation laws, making it really pretty much impossible for Black Americans to settle in a lot of towns in the United States. They had to be out by sundown or face jail time or a lynch mob. So it's also believed that the legend might have been caused by just a simple case of mistaken identity. There was another blues singer by the name of Tommy Johnson, same last name, different first name, no relation. He did claim that he had made a pact with the devil, and that's how he had gotten his talent, but he said this about himself as part of his own hype, right? This was his shtick, his, come see me perform. I made a deal with the devil to get this good, right? And the film Oh Brother, Where Art Thou features a Tommy Johnson, right, who sold his soul to the devil, which is based on the real Tommy Johnson. So I think a lot of people believe, and I probably agree with it, is that somewhere along the line somebody confused these two guys, and that's why people think it's Robert.
I think it's also the musician selling his soul to the devil is kind of an older story already. Like in Europe, we have Paganini, or this kind of violin players who sold their soul to the devil because they are so unbelievably talented and, so.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good story.
It's a great story. Makes a good song.
Yeah.
He didn't sell his soul to the devil. The Faustian pact has been debunked. But what really happened to him is maybe more interesting. So we do have his death certificate, but even that is tricky. Most agree that he got very ill on August 13th, and after several days in terrible pain, he died on August the 16th, 3 days later. We do have a copy of the front of the death certificate, and scrawled in cursive writing over the spot where, there's like a whole area where it's like cause of death, manner of death, attending, all this information. And just across that, in cursive, it says, no doctor. There was a doctor in the area, and when he became really ill, they did bring him to the doctor, who was at the nearest plantation. But because Robert wasn't the men who worked on the plantation that he was employed by, the doctor wasn't being paid to take care of him and refused to see him. So, that's nice. What could have been the cause of death then? So, one of Johnson's researchers is a man by the name of Gale Dean Wardlow. And he says that he had requested a copy of the original death certificate. And so he got the one that we can all see. And then he requested that they also photograph the back of this death certificate. And he says that on the back of the original death certificate is written by the original plantation owner. And it claimed that Robert had died on his property of syphilis at the plantation. Now, there are sources who will list syphilis as Robert Johnson's cause of death. And if you listen to our John List episode, you know that syphilis will definitely kill you and kill you horribly. But it is a slow death, right? Nobody is struck down by acute syphilis. I don't think that's a thing. And there's also a real problem with this because claiming that Black people had syphilis was a really common way to reinforce those ignorance-driven segregation laws, right? And because of Tuskegee, which of course is a whole other episode on its own, I don't think you can ever trust a syphilis claim on any person of color in that time. I just think if you see that, you immediately have to just discredit it. So I don't buy it.
I mean, I don't think you have to completely discredit every case, but you definitely have to take a lot of things into consideration and think that it's probably not the case.
Right. Oh, sure. I mean,
you know
syphilis kills everybody indiscriminately. It's not that, but yes, I know exactly what you mean. But so often you'll see people with no signs of or history of syphilis, and it's just written syphilis is their cause of death. So another theory, now we're getting closer to maybe the truth here, I think. Another theory is that Johnson enjoyed his moonshine and he had a terrible ulcer, and those things do not mix well at all. So it's possible that he suffered a GI bleed from an ulcer, and this could have killed him. It's possible, it fits him being in pain, and it fits the reports that there was blood in his mouth before he died. Another medical condition that could explain it was published more recently. In 2006, Dr. David Connell posited in the British Medical Journal, based on 2 photos that we have of Johnson, that he may have had Marfan syndrome. So the Mayo Clinic says this about Marfan, quote, Marfan syndrome is an inherited disorder that affects connective tissue. Marfan syndrome most commonly affects the heart, eyes, blood vessels, and skeleton. People with Marfan are usually tall and thin with unusually long arms, legs, fingers, and toes. The damage caused by Marfan syndrome can be mild or severe. If your aorta, the large blood vessel that carries blood from your heart to the rest of your body, is affected, the condition can become life-threatening. End quote. I have to say, glancing at his fingers, he does seem to be a candidate for this. He has incredibly long, graceful fingers, probably made it for good guitar playing. But if he did have Marfan, a vascular rupture could definitely explain his death. And then, of course, there's one more possibility of how Robert Johnson died, and that's murder. So this story goes that the charming and talented musician may have paid a little bit too much attention to the woman who had a jealous boyfriend or husband as a bar owner, and he was murdered for it. This has been alleged by many people, including the Robert Johnson Foundation's website. Their website says that, quote, 1938, August 13th, Robert Johnson is poisoned at the Three Forks Mercantile Store outside Greenwood where he is playing. He's initially taken to Tush Hogg's house on the Star of the West plantation right next to Three Forks. When he does not get better, he is brought back to the house in which he was staying in Baptist Town, the black section of Greenwood. End quote. So, was he murdered? Plenty of his contemporaries think that he was and claim that they were there when it happened, that they saw the owner of the bar poison the whiskey and warned him not to drink it, but he drank it anyway. There's also speculation about what kind of poison got him, from strychnine to mothballs. Unfortunately, and ultimately, there's really no way to know for sure. Even his cause of death is not 100% certain. It's attributed to either internal bleeding, or potentially poisoning, or fighting off a poisoning and then dying from pneumonia. Even the definite location of his grave is in question. There are 3 markers in 3 different places, but most historians now agree he's probably buried at Mount Zion Cemetery in Greenwood, Mississippi. Somewhere there. But we don't know exactly where, because at that time, African Americans were buried in unmarked graves. And even today, there are unmarked cemeteries containing, really countless remains of enslaved Black Americans, and more remains are found on a pretty regular basis. Robert Johnson was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame in 1980, its very first year that it became a thing. He became a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986 and was given a Lifetime Achievement Grammy posthumously in 2006.
Can you imagine what he would think of that?
I know, right? Amazing.
He sold 5,000 copies of his song, and that was like the biggest thing ever. And now he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Blues Hall of Fame, and he won a Grammy.
Everything he ever wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even more because he when he was alive, he didn't know about any Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or Grammy.
It's true. He had a really, really fascinating life. There are a lot of books out there about him.
Documentaries.
Yeah, I've got to watch the documentary. There's a Netflix documentary I haven't watched yet, and a bunch of books I want to read. I think I listen to murder rather than listen to the blues, right? It's a similar idea for me, that empathy sort of feeling. I don't know how to explain it, but blues music always made me too sad, so I just never listened to it very much. But yeah, fascinating man. A lot we couldn't get into, and interesting life.
Definitely. And I can recommend to everybody to go to Clarksdale.
I would love to.
Really so full of history. Amazing. All right, next up we have the death of Brian Jones, founding member of the Rolling Stones, the man who named the band, and the events surrounding his untimely death, including a deathbed confession, claiming that his death wasn't an accident. I know Annie loves a good deathbed confession.
I do.
Could it be murder? Is this our first deathbed confession we ever really talk about?
I think it is. I think deathbed confessions are something we always hope for, but they don't happen that often.
It's your Hail Mary.
Yeah, right? It's good stuff. All right, let's get into it.
So, Louis Brian Hopkins Jones, what a name, called Brian, was born on February 28th, so one day after my birthday, 1942, in Cheltenham, Gloucestershire, England. Brian's parents were Louis and Louisa Jones, and they both had musical talent, and he had two younger sisters. The family experienced tragedy early on when his sister Pamela died of leukemia in 1945, just a few weeks after she turned 2. When Brian was 4, he suffered a nasty viral infection that left him suffering from asthma for the rest of his life, which wasn't too much of a problem. He wasn't interested in sports anyway, but he did love music, and his talents in music was apparent from a very early age. His parents listened to mostly classical music, but when Brian was around 15, he discovers jazz music, and he talked his parents into buying him a saxophone. When he was 16, he got his 14-year-old girlfriend pregnant and ended up leaving school as a result. I think it's fair to say he enjoyed the company of girls and women and got a lot of them pregnant.
So many.
He had fathered 5 children from 5 different women by the time he was 22 and had nothing to do with any of his children. I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that he was rather irresponsible. I think that's fair to say.
I think that's fair, yep.
When he was 17, he got an acoustic guitar from his parents as a birthday gift, but things at home weren't going well. It seems getting a second girl pregnant was more than his parents could take, and he was ultimately tossed out of his parents' home, quit school, and ended up surviving by busking for a summer.
Yeah, he was one of those street performers you toss coins to. It's funny because a lot of the stuff that you read about him talks about how hard it was because he had to drop out of school because the kids were really mean to him about getting his girlfriend pregnant. And then also there's another bit I read where they were like, he even sold some of his favorite records to help buy his newborn son some clothing. And you're like, wow, was it hard for him then? It's like no mention of these lives that he very sort of casually ruins, right? But anyway.
Anyway, he wasn't worried about child support, but this whole experience just made him realize how much he wanted his own band. He played for a while, taking various jazz gigs, where he used the name Elmo Lewis and played slide guitar. He played jazz sets pretty regularly with a drummer named Charlie Watts.
Foreshadowing.
And he played in a band with Paul Jones called The Roosters. In 1962, when he was 20, he placed an ad in Jazz News looking to start his own band. Answering the ad would be a couple of talented nobodies, Mick Jagger and his friend Keith Richards. Well, two of them. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards reconnected on a train platform in 1961 and they hit it off right away, which isn't too surprising because they'd gone to school together as kids for a few years. They had been looking to start their own band and had seen Jones play at the Ealing Jazz Club. And they liked what they heard and a band was born. Jones was a huge blues fan, so it's fitting that his story comes right after Robert Johnson's story.
Mm-hmm.
And he was acting as their manager and he was finding himself in a pinch. He was needing a name to get them booked. Muddy Waters' Rolling Stone was the inspiration for the name of the band that we of course know as the Rolling Stones. One of my dad's favorite bands in the world. Yeah. Don't worry about the Roosters though, because when Brian Jones left that band to become a Rolling Stone, a promising young musician by the name of Eric Clapton took his place. The Rolling Stones had a few members in and out in the very early days, but they found the right combination, and the band included Mick Jagger as a lead singer, Brian Jones, Keith Richards on guitar, Charlie Watts on drums, and Bill Wyman on bass. Brian could play anything with a reed, keyboard, or strings, including the harp, which I find fascinating.
He could play anything.
Anything, and he could figure out most other instruments very quickly. He's a little bit like my sister there.
Yes.
My sister is the same. It's fascinating.
I wish I had that skill. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. Of course, the charismatic Mick Jagger quickly became the band's frontman, but behind the scenes, Brian was the one who managed most of everything to do with the band until they hired Andrew Oldham as manager in 1963. Oldham was a young hustler who had done publicity work for Bob Dylan and the Beatles before a friend suggested he check out, that Rolling Stones band, and he had a lot of ideas for them. This band wouldn't be mistaken for the Beatles. They weren't as family friendly, and Oldham wanted the Stones to be the kind of music your parents wouldn't approve of. They got girls pregnant, they got arrested for drug possession. Oldham even lied about their ages to make them seem younger. I always found it so interesting that there was like this battle between the Stones fans and the Beatles fans, when behind the scenes they were all friends and kind of all did the same things. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Initially, the band performed blues, jazz, and rock classics written by others, and then worked through creating new music together. But soon Jagger and Richards became a songwriting power duo and were encouraged by Oldham. In 1965, Brian Jones met and began a relationship with model and it girl Anita Pallenberg. So she was in Munich and had seen them in concert while on tour, and Brian spoke German and they became friends and then they became a couple. And they were together for 2 years, but in 1967 Richards had been staying with them while his place was being renovated, and then the three went on a trip to Morocco. And while there, Jones became quite sick, and so he was at the hospital, and Pallenberg and Keith Richards started to hang out together more, and they ended up together. And they would stay together for a while, and she would have 3 children with Keith Richards, so it's not like this casual affair. But that didn't make Brian any less devastated.
No. And we should also note that both Pallenberg and Richards said that Jones was physically abusive toward Anita. So it doesn't seem like Anita and Brian had like a super healthy relationship before she left him for Richards. Yeah. It's all just more complicated than his best friend stole his girl narrative. We're not getting into it. That's not what this is about, but just in the sake of fairness.
Yeah, true. Now, I don't think any of you need us to tell you that the Rolling Stones had a lot of success in the UK and the US, and then, of course, worldwide. But by the time Beggar's Banquet came out, so that's in 1968, Jones wasn't really participating in the band as much anymore. All along, Jones had been doing side projects that interested him, including sound effects and background vocals on the Beatles, the Yellow Submarine. He was in Jimi Hendrix's version of All Along the Watchtower. You can hear Brian Jones on percussion in that recording, a few others. But he was becoming more and more withdrawn from the band, sometimes traveling alone to gigs and on tour, sometimes not showing up for photo shoots or rehearsals, and his role in the band kept getting made smaller by his bandmates. In the fall of 1968, Brian purchased Cochford Farm, and he wasn't the first celebrity to do so, which is also fascinating. Purchased in 1925 by A. Milne as a retreat for writing, the house dates back to the mid-16th century. And here, Milne wrote about Christopher Robin and his adventures with Winnie the Pooh. Located in Hartfield in East Sussex, the Grade 2 listed estate has a 9.5 acres or 3.8 hectares plot with a heated outdoor swimming pool added by the people Brian Jones purchased it from. And he also has a fish pond.
That's horse land. That's a really nice amount of land.
Yeah, horse land.
Yeah. There's like all these Winnie the Pooh statues, and there's like a really famous sundial that people like trespass to see.
It's just a stunning home.
Yeah.
And was for sale again recently, so we've got photos to share if you want to see it. In December of 1968, Jones made his last big appearance with the Stones, and he was moody and increasingly unstable. He was negatively impacting those around him, and his bandmates were increasingly impatient with him and sick of his behavior, which I think we can all understand.
Yeah.
Just kind of unprofessional, which, yeah.
I mean, you have to deal with me every week.
You're never moody.
Oh, I'm not moody, no, that's true. I cry a lot, though.
Okay. When the band realized that because of his 2 drug arrests, Brian wouldn't be able to get a visa and join them on a US tour, it was the last straw, and they'd had enough, and on 8th of June 1969, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts informed him that he was no longer a member of the band he created, and told him that he could say whatever he wanted about his departure. So, what did he say? Probably the truth, at least in a part, because his statement read, quote, "I no longer see eye to eye with the others over the discs we are cutting. I want to play my kind of music, which is no longer the Stones' music. The music Mick and Keith have been writing has progressed as a tangent as far as my own taste is concerned." End quote. I think that happens a lot to bands, that they just grow apart. I think if you are kind of artistic, creative person, and you're in a band, everybody at one point starts to develop in a different kind of direction.
He was a very sort of forward-thinking musical genius, probably, who I think he always had to be doing the next thing, trying the next sound. And I think the rest of the band, they found something that worked for them. I mean,
it's like with the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson.
Exactly.
He's this musical genius, and Mike Love wanted to stick with the formula.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
It's, it was the only thing that could happen.
But yeah, Brian Jones was still making music and talking to other musicians about forming a new band. Brian still owned Cochford Farm, and, it's going to need some work done, so that will keep him busy. So he hires a builder named Frank Thorogood to do the work. So that's £18,000 worth of work. And Frank is also living at the farm because, it's easier that way. And he's probably living in the guest house. Doesn't really matter though. So, and this Frank Thorogood, the worker, is living there with his friend or girlfriend. She's a nurse by the name of Janet Lawson. And on the night of 2nd of July 1969, Brian and his Swedish girlfriend Anna were in the pool that night. And she says she went to get him an asthma inhaler, and when she returned, she found him at the bottom of the pool. 27-year-old Brian Jones was dead. But what had happened? So, from the Guardian archive, 8th of July 1969, titled "Jones Drowned While Drunk and Drugged." Quote, "Brian Jones, the former Rolling Stone, drowned in the swimming pool of his farmhouse in Sussex, quote, while under the influence of alcohol and drugs," end quote, a coroner said yesterday. The East Sussex coroner, Dr. Angus Somerville, recorded death by misadventure. Miss Janet Lawson, a state-registered nurse and a friend of Jones, said she knew him through her friend, Mr. Frank Thorogood, a builder who was modernizing Jones's farm. At 10:30 on the night he drowned, Jones had gone to Thorogood's flat and asked him to join him, Miss Lawson said. quote, he had been drinking and he was a bit unsteady on his feet, end quote. They joined Jones and his girlfriend, Miss Anna Wolin, at the farmhouse. Both Jones and his girlfriend were drinking spirits. Quote, I attempted conversation, but it was a little garbled. Jones said it was because he had had his sleepers, end quote, Miss Lawson said. She understood these to be sleeping tablets. Jones told them he was going to swim and mounted the springboard. He had difficulty, but Frank Thorogood tried to assist him. Quote, despite his condition, he was able to swim. However, he was rather sluggish, end quote, Miss Lawson said. She then left the pool thinking that Jones was all right. Miss Lawson went on, quote, Frank then returned to the house and asked for a towel. I immediately went to the pool and saw Brian at the bottom, quite motionless. I sensed the worst and shouted to Anna and Frank, end quote. Miss Lawson said she and the others got Jones out of the pool and laid him on his back. She began pumping water out of him, quote, but I got very little out, end quote. She gave him heart massage for about 15 minutes and Miss Wolin tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Anna Wolin, aged 22, told the inquest that she had only known Jones for 2 or 3 months. She told the coroner they had wine at dinner. Jones occasionally had brandy. Dr. Albert Sachs, a pathologist, said he found no evidence in the lung to suggest Jones had had a recent attack of asthma, but it was evident that he had some form of chronic bronchial trouble. Quote, for a man of his age, his heart was a bit larger than it should have been. It was fatty and flabby. His liver was twice the normal weight, end quote. His blood contained 140 milligrams per cent of alcohol, but there was no evidence of barbiturates. It was obvious on examining his blood that Jones had consumed a large quantity of drugs. Mr. Thorogood said that on the night Jones died, he had gone, at Jones' request, to buy bottles of brandy, wine, whiskey, and soda, end quote.
That's a lot to... The description of Jones being stumbly, slurry drunk and on a diving board makes me so physically uncomfortable. I can't even... Yeah. Oh, that was like, yeah.
So it's super possible that it was an accidental drowning, right?
Yeah.
Or was it? Because Anna thinks he was murdered by the builder he'd hired. He'd paid Frank Thorogood 18,000 pounds already, and Anna believes Frank tried to get more money out of Brian and murdered him in a rage when he didn't get his way. She wrote a book called The Murder of Brian Jones, alleging that this is what happened. And she's not the only one who thinks that, because backing up her claim is the Stones' chauffeur Brian Keylock. He said that on his deathbed, Thorogood confessed his crime to him, saying, quote, in 1993, I went to see Frank in hospital and he said, it was me that done Brian. I said, I'll come back tomorrow and you can tell me more. But he died during the night. I never found out the specifics, end quote. So yeah, it's safe to say that a lot of people believe that Brian was murdered. And despite allegations that police bungled the initial investigation, so they covered up that it was a murder, but that also seems untrue and it has been re-examined by police. And in a 2019 article for Sky News, Andy Hayes and Tom Gillespie write, quote, Sussex police responded to the various claims most recently in March this year, saying, quote, the death of Brian Jones was investigated in 1969 and was also the subject of 2 reviews by Sussex police in 1984 and 1994. From time to time over the past 49 years, Sussex police have also received messages or reports from journalists and other individuals about the death. Each is considered on its individual merits and reviewed wherever appropriate. No such report has been received since 2010 and no new evidence has emerged to suggest that the coroner's original verdict of death by misadventure was incorrect. The case has not been reopened and there are no plans for that to happen, end quote.
Yeah, I think that it probably was death by misadventure, which is how the coroner ruled it. I think sometimes we can just be so desperate for a why. You know what I mean? Like sometimes the untimely death of someone is so shocking that it's like you need there to be a reason. It can't just
something
be
bigger than that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And you have to try to find fault with somebody, because I never really had the angry phase with grief, but it's really common for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
And so if you are very angry, you don't want to direct it at the person you love, so you direct it at someone who you think is maybe responsible for their death.
1000%.
Right?
Yeah.
I think accidental drownings happen so much more frequently than we think.
So often and so quickly. Yeah. As for Cochford Farm, there was a developer who bought it in 1970, and I find that so interesting. To help pay for the cost of refurbishment, he sold the tiles from the pool Jones died in to fans for £100 each, and that way he raised £12,000. The next thing, he also said, you wouldn't expect it, because he also said he preferred Jones fans to the Winnie Pooh fans, who apparently trespass on the grounds constantly.
You know, those Winnie the Pooh fans, lawless bunch of crazies.
Crazy looky-loos. An excerpt from Brian's August 9th, 1969 obituary in Rolling Stone magazine by Grail Marcus, quote, Jones was perhaps more of a Rolling Stone than any of the others. What the Stones as a group sang about, what Jagger and Richard wrote about, Jones did. And he did it right out in public. And he got caught, and he looked the part. Paternity suits even in the early days, dope busts, pink suits, chartreuse suits, the bell of yellow hair, and the impish grin, even the red and yellow stripes he wore that made Mick Jagger look like he was wearing Salvation Army leftovers. That was Brian Jones, a true rake. He wasn't acting out the Stones' music, he just happened to be the Stones' music. End quote.
That's a good quote.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a great obituary. He was buried in Cheltenham 10 feet down, rather than the more traditional 6, to try and ensure no grave-robbing souvenir hunters got any ideas.
Can you imagine? Of course we can imagine. It happens all the time.
Yeah, we can, because it happens all the time.
We'll tell you about it soon.
And that is the story of the life and death of Brian Jones, who is often considered the first victim of the 27 Club. But now you know he was the second, but definitely not the last. And we'll be back next week for part 2 of the 27 Club, right?
That's right. We absolutely will be. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be good. Also, if you or someone you love is struggling with mental health or addiction, please reach out to a loved one for help. In the USA, you can call 1-800-662-HELP. We also have resources as a pinned post on our Facebook page. So, what about something good? I know what your something good is.
Yeah, my something good is that my husband is here.
Hooray.
We've just returned we've been in Vienna today for lunch. We always like to go to ramen bars in Vienna when he's here, because that's the only thing I don't dare to cook. It's so much work. And yeah, we're just gonna enjoy the next 10 days.
Awesome.
On Sunday, friends are coming over for barbecue. And we're just gonna take it easy and relax a little bit.
I hope you have a really nice time.
What about your something good?
We opened the cottage for the season. Big thanks to Misty and family. I love, you know, how when you just have friends that become family, and their whole family becomes family. So nice. We also watched Ghostbusters Afterlife. Finally, I've been dying to see it, and I absolutely loved it. Have you seen it yet?
No, I haven't yet. I have to still watch it.
If you guys liked the original, absolutely watch it. Absolutely watch it. You're gonna love it. It's great. It's really nostalgic. It's like you'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll jump.
Awesome.
I loved it. I hope you like it. So that's it for this week, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like more information on our Patreon, you can visit patreon.com and search for Fresh Hell Podcast. We just discussed the tragic car accidents that killed Jane Mansfield and Isadora Duncan.
It was so interesting. I learned a couple of new things about their death.
Yeah, you know what I forgot to mention was that Jane Mansfield, when she met Mickey Hargitay, she met him at Mae West's review. He was a muscle man who was featured in Mae West's stage show. So that is how they met. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was fun. I watched about 4 seconds of that video. I'm not going to use those headphones again. The microphone was terrible. And also, I feel like it's been reaffirmed that I have a face for podcasting because I can't fit both my forehead and my chin into the same screen.
It was a little bit shaky on your part,
I don't know.
but it was fun.
Watch it.
If you get seasick, just close your eyes and listen to Annie's beautiful voice.
I have a face for radio. So, yeah. We're also going to be announcing our next game night soon for Patreon, so please keep your eyes out. And what else? Podcast Top 50?
Yes, if you go to podcastmagazine.com/hot50, you can vote daily for your 3 favorite podcasts, and we would so appreciate it if you would vote for us.
Yeah,
Please.
that would be awesome.
That would be great.
Yeah.
That's my goal. Annie's goal is 1,000 reviews on iTunes USA.
We have gotten so many nice reviews lately.
Yeah.
Thank you. We see them. We love them. It makes our day. We so appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, and that's it for this week's. Please say hi to your pets, all of them. I'm not gonna start naming all the different kinds of pets, but there are so many now already. Please keep posting their photos. I love to see them. Annie loves to see them. They make our day.
We love it.
Also, give other humans the benefit of the doubt just as much as you give yourself the benefit of the doubt, because, hey, it's hard out there. We're having a rough time, all of us, and that's it, I think, right?
That's it. Yeah. And just remember, if you're having a hard time, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
bye.